Hi, this is Paul Carroll. I'm the editor-in-chief at Insurance.Leadership. I'm delighted to be here today to moderate a webinar on how to use AI to optimize care in workers' comp claims. I can assure you that this will be a very pithy and practical webinar. And I'm thankful that Clara has sponsored this. I'm also thankful for the panel of rock stars that we have with us here today. We have Gary Hagmuller, who is not only the CEO at Clara Analytics, but has more than 20 years experience with AI and machine learning in enterprise applications. Nicole Corey, who is a more than 20-year adjuster in California, who is now consulting on just about every aspect of the workers' comp claims process with both injured employees and with employers. And then with Dr. Kim, who not only has an MD, but also has a master's in public health and an MBA, and a list of professional affiliations and articles to his credit that basically gives him a pedigree as long as my arm. So we'll get going here by focusing on the three main issues. We'll talk about the AI cycle in claims, about 3 ways that AI can improve provider selection and management, and then the impact of AI. I'll note before I turn this over to Gary that you do have a button on your screen that will give you access to resources, the slides, and then other materials. You also have a way to ask questions because this is on demand. We can't obviously be doing those live, but if you ask a question, someone from Clara would be happy to get back to you as quickly as possible with a specific answer. So, Gary, if you could maybe start us off by talking a bit about the cycle of AI and claims.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thanks, Paul. I appreciate the lead in there. So I think one of the first things I think is worth talking about is just the definition of what artificial intelligence even is, right? I find that I spend a lot of my time trying to debunk a whole bunch of myths and other things that seem to be perpetuated out in the marketplace. What artificial intelligence is not is kind of this rise of the machine. The machine's going to go off and interact and take care of, do our jobs or anything else like that. What artificial intelligence today is kind of an assembly of very advanced techniques, analytical techniques that people generally run to try to tease out insights out of information that perhaps are too difficult for a human to find. Or basically too complex and elusive. And so some of the techniques, you see some listed here as examples, right? Like deep learning is this type of technology where you show the machine thousands, if not millions of pictures of something with a label so that the machine kind of picks up the nuances of what it's looking for. So over time, it can identify, oh, okay, got it. That's a cat. That is not a cat. That sort of stuff. There's other types of applications like natural language processing, where what we're trying to do is pull apart the speech or written text that people have and trying to tease out what the nuances or what the sentiment are in those things. And there's a whole lot of other techniques, and I won't go into it. But really what winds up happening here, there's really 2 main applications that we see in the artificial intelligence space. One is one that most everybody calls automation, right? And what automation generally works well for is things where there's lots of transactions, the variability between elements is not particularly great, and it's something that over time you probably don't want people doing, right? Because it's probably mundane or boring or something that isn't really going to be a great application for humans. There's a second form of AI, and that's the one I think we're going to talk about the most today, and that is one where we call augmentation, or I've heard enhancement is another one that's being used. And that's one where what we're doing is we're helping the person who's working with the data understand and appreciate the things within that data that really perhaps are difficult for them to get, right? Because keep in mind, it's hard for humans to have really complex association or understand the complex associations between a large number of data elements, right? And so in this sense, what we're doing is we're trying to get people to to be better, faster, smarter, and I jokingly like to call it that we're basically giving people superpowers that they wouldn't otherwise have. Okay, so that's a bit on what artificial intelligence is. Let's talk a little bit about the cycle in claims and how you actually go about implementing a solution. And by the way, we talk about this in claims, but this is pretty much how it goes for just about every application in almost every industry. And I'll go in depth on all of these points in a few moments, but at a high level, what you're trying to do here is grab together as much data as you possibly can. The more data, the better. You're going to then normalize that data and make it usable by the machine. You're then going to take one of those techniques that I described earlier, or maybe multiple techniques. That's a common approach too. And you're going to try to train a model, right? And what the model is going to try to do is to then give you predictions, right? What is important within that data set, and if I add new elements, where are those elements going to show up in the future, right? And so that's what you're trying to do. The final piece of it, and this is probably one of the most important aspects of it, at least as it pertains to the sort of AI where humans need to trust it, and this is the augmentation piece that I talked about, is you're trying to basically help people understand, well, why did the machine come up with that suggestion, right? Why did it come up with that prediction, right? And that's a really important element. So now let me walk you through in depth those four pieces of it. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to assemble as much data together as possible, right? So in machine learning, it's kind of the opposite of the way you would do normal analytical projects. Normally, what you try to do is figure out the things that really matter and get rid of all the rest of the stuff that's kind of extraneous, right? In AI solutions, what you're going to do is the exact opposite. You're going to try to bring in as many possible elements together, because each little element that you add may have some weak signal effect that, when combined with a multitude of other things, could wind up becoming very deterministic as to what you're looking for. So you're going to cobble all these together, right? And then you're going to do these techniques, and you see some of them listed here, but it's all about like trying to understand and transform the data so that it becomes very useful for the machine to try to project out features or other stuff. And even at this stage, you're going to start to see some significant benefits, right? The insights you can see just out of aggregating this data and doing a lot of extractions themselves could have quite a bit of value, right? There's places where you can start to see patterns like sentiment or likelihood of something happening, like an attorney or a doctor being associated or whatever else. So there's a lot of things that come right out of the gate as you do this. Now, let's move on to the second step. We're going to train our models, right? So what we do when we train models is we go and we take that data that we just talked about before and brought together and normalized, right? And we're going to dig through it and try to get a model that's going to give us a really clear sense of what's in the data and what's valuable, right? And the way to think about this is as follows, right? If you ask an adjuster to come up with a severity score for a particular claim, right? What they're going to do is they're going to look through a bunch of case records and files and all that sort of stuff. And from the experience we've seen, we're able to benchmark the fact that roughly 50% of the time they're going to be spot on in terms of the severity, but a lot of times they're going to be off, right? Now, if you move into a machine learning application, right, and we're just focused on the data that comes from a particular customer, right, we're moving pretty significantly up the accuracy level when we train our model using a machine learning approach, right? Then finally, then this is a thing that we like to focus on quite a bit, because it's something that I think is a really powerful thing for the industry itself. If you bring together data from a variety of different carriers or people who are insured, you're going to see way more phenomenon, right? And so you're going to be much more accurate on that. And you can get into the realm of 90% plus if you train your data or you train your models on an industry-wide data lake, right? It's just something that that is a good idea. So then once we have a trained model, now we're going to try to predict things, right? And so predicting is one of the core functions that you're going to do in AI and machine learning, right? And so here, what we're doing is in most claims, there's kind of a life of a claim, right? It starts, a variety of things happen. You get to see a doctor, you get medications, there's time off from work, what have you. There's a whole bunch of things that wind up happening. And then occasionally what can happen is something could go wrong, right? You could see a physician that perhaps doesn't have a great reputation for getting stuff done, or you could get a prescription for something that might indicate that there's more pain going on than perhaps is reported to the adjuster. And so it's really important to kind of understand these data elements so that you can predict that, okay, something is changing and I need to take some action, okay? And the final level is once you've done a good job of predicting it, what you're going to really want to do now is basically get the adjuster or whoever to take some action, right? And in order for humans to really trust the systems that they work on, they need to understand, well, why is it giving me the indication that it is? And so what you do in a circumstance like this is you try to give them as information rich and as simple as possible a way of understanding, well, why is it that we've made a recommendation, or why is it that we're predicting a certain thing to be out there, so that the human can then figure out, okay, this makes sense to me and I'm going to take this action, or I understand why the machine is suggesting what's going on here, but I have this sense of what I think is going to be more important because I've seen this before, or I know this, doctor or this drug or whatever it winds up being, right? And it's really in that explainability that you get to ROI, because the more precise and effective actions you get, obviously the greater the benefit that you're going to accrue. So that hopefully gives everybody kind of a simple sense for how AI kind of stacks up in the claims environment at a simple level. And Paul, let me hand it back to you to take us further from here.
Sure, that's great. So let's talk now a little bit about provider selection very specifically. As you can see from this slide, it can be pretty chaotic in the traditional approach. Somebody gets injured, maybe they go to urgent care, maybe they schedule a visit, and they sort of get set with that initial provider, but it's not necessarily the best provider for them. It's sort of who the coworker knew, or who somebody in the family knew, or whatever. So the adjuster can have a fair amount of influence over who that provider is if the adjuster is involved early and has the right sort of information. A lot can happen if the initial provider connection with the worker works very well, and a lot can go wrong if it doesn't. Nicole, could you take us through a little bit how this looks from an adjuster standpoint?
Sure, Paul. I'm thrilled to be here and participate in today's discussion. Typically, when an employee is injured at work, they are directed to the occupational clinic that their employer uses. And typically their employer is notified or given a list of occupational clinics nearby from a medical provider network that their insurance carrier uses. So direction by the employer, but originating from the medical provider network or the MPN of the carrier. Now, not all times does it work that way. Perhaps the employee has decided to seek treatment days after the initial injury. Perhaps they've been directed by their primary care physician that this is a work-related injury and they need to see a doctor under workers' compensation. So we go back to the insurance carrier or their typical adjuster and say, hey, where do I send this guy? So having a network that you can go to that perhaps has these doctors graded, or that you have some confidence in when you're recommending these doctors is fantastic.
Okay, so that's the baseline. Gary, can you take what you said about AI before and explain how you can get to a better scoring approach and feed better data to adjusters like Nicole?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so I think this is a great showcase for how AI actually kind of improves the game here. Because what AI is able to do is to look through a huge number of data elements, kind of what I described earlier, looking at a variety of different facets for how a particular provider winds up treating claims, right? And then is able to basically understand which ones are going to give you, or which provider is going to be able to give you kind of the best outcomes or not. And it's a very complicated thing. And let me tell you why, right? Because there's going to be certain people who are going to see very complex sorts of claims, right? Well, they may be naturally more expensive claims to treat by virtue of the fact that they are more severe or complex or whatever else, right? And so what we do in the machine learning sense or the AI sense is we feed all these different data elements in there that kind of gives us a sense for like, okay, well, this this claim is quite complex, right? And so therefore, this longer time away from work or more expensive nature of the claim is warranted, and this provider is actually doing a very good job, right? Keeping it to an optimal outcome, right? And then in other instances, we can look at the claim characteristics and then determine that, well, in fact, this provider is actually causing somebody to come back for multiple visits that are unusual or costly, or perhaps they have a higher propensity to wind up having patients that wind up litigating or other things like that. And so it's really the nuance of that data we described earlier that really has ground truth. And that's the important piece, right? You're looking at closed claims over a long period of time and then matching the provider against their actual performance. And in that way, you have a very fair, a very balanced way of understanding, which one's going to provide the optimal amount of care for a given claim.
Dr. Kim, how does this look from the caregiver perspective?
Well, I agree with Nicole, Paul and Gary as well. As a treating physician, I don't really particularly like being graded, but I think there's a value, so I'm full support of it. Because having a right treating physician makes the difference, right? It can determine the outcome of the claim when you have a quality doctors involved. So, and also in addition to that, as a primary treating physician, if I am going to be referring patients to a secondary treating physician, I want to be reassured. I want to be confident in that transfer of the care or referral, where another doctor who coming into the claim can continue providing the excellent care to improve the medical treatment of the patient and bring a better outcome. And I really think AI can help with this.
Great, thanks. So to move to the next application on tracking the claim once it's now been initiated, you can see from the slide that it can be a really complicated process. So you have the initial connection with some sort of a provider, but then you may get another provider and repeat visits and another provider and follow up. And it's not like an adjuster only has one of these cases to be tracking at a time. An adjuster may have more than 100 cases going. So from the adjuster standpoint, this actually kind of reminds me of a story I saw the other day about hospitals still living in a fax machine world. Some hospital in Houston had somebody come in and found hundreds of sheets of paper all over the floor because somebody had sent in some test results. There actually was an issue in Washington State where they had to bring in the National Guard to help with data entry because of all the fax machine data that they had. So obviously the situations are different, but it seems to me that adjusters in some ways are still being forced to live in a fax machine kind of world, and that AI can do a lot to help sort through that and get the right information to the adjuster at an appropriate time. Gary, do you want to walk us through a little bit about how that works?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think this is, you remember earlier I talked about having adjusters get superpowers by using AI. This is a great example of how this comes into practice, right? You're right. It's a really complicated environment, especially in the more complicated claims, right? Because you're going to have multiple different treatments by multiple different specialists or other things like that, right? And so one of the things that an adjuster can use to kind of help them navigate their way through where to spend their time and attention is really using a technology like this. And the way that works in a simple way is that if somebody, the claimant is going to a new specialist or something to that effect, who's quite highly rated and who is likely going to do an excellent job on the particular injury that's involved, well, the adjuster maybe doesn't need to spend quite as much time navigating that claim, right? Because they're probably in a good place. Now, if the flip side is true and somebody winds up going to a provider that perhaps is not as highly rated, the machine can alert the adjuster, right? So the adjuster doesn't have to be sitting in the stream of data thinking about like, okay, is this doctor good or bad or whatever. The adjuster can basically get an alert from the machine that gives them, again, evidence-based reasons for why this adjuster, or I'm sorry, this provider might be one that you want to spend a little bit more time managing through, right? And in that way, you wind up getting into a better outcome for the claim, right? So it's a way to basically make people much more effective and efficient in what they're doing.
I can imagine that sort of commentary is key to all this. Nicole, from an adjuster standpoint, how does this look? Does this, in fact, make your life a lot easier?
Well, truthfully, coming from a place of where I was kind of anti-AI in the last 5 years or 5 years ago, I have really come to appreciate what AI does bring to the adjuster role. Anytime you can make the job easier of an adjuster, you are more likely to have that process adopted. I mentioned this MPN earlier, and so often nowadays we just send the link out, whether it's to an employer, to an injured worker, because that's the easiest thing to do, and the injured worker can sort through and do their Google searches and figure out what doctor they want to see. But if I have confidence in the product and I can recognize that guiding the injured worker to a doctor that I know is not going to keep them off work, not going to overtreat, not going to over-medicate, it's worthwhile for me to take that time, perhaps send a list of doctors that I'm comfortable with to that injured worker and let them choose from there. So I think this is a great tool to keep claims moving in the right direction and out of attorney hands.
A quick follow-up. Gary had talked before about enhancing what the adjuster does. I know there's always talk with AI that people are going to be replaced, but you do see this as enhancing, not replacing what you do, right?
Oh, absolutely. This is going to make the adjuster's job easier, more streamlined, to get a heads up because this employee has been off work longer than he should be. It's another set of eyes, another set of helpful hands to do a better job on my claims, not do the job of my claims, but help me do a better job.
Makes sense. McKinsey, which I've done a fair amount of work with over the years, did a study finding that the only job that's ever actually been eliminated is an elevator operator. And I think people are maybe happy not to have those jobs around anymore. I use the term centaur to talk about the sort of half man, half machine kind of capability that I think is going to become increasingly the case. So basically you get better information, you get a lot of the drudgery out of your life, and you get to do the kind of stuff you like doing, which is helping people more than you could in the past. So Dr. Kim, over to you. Again, if you could walk us through how this looks from the caregiver perspective.
Yeah, I definitely welcome this as a new change that we're going through. The first, I think it can help doctors be a better doctors, getting a feedback from a fair assessment, not 50-50 chances that Gary talked about previously, but having an actual accurate assessment of where a provider can improve on is a welcome opportunity from my perspective to be better. The other thing is working with adjusters who has an access to things like Clara can really streamline the delivery of the treatment, because as Nicole mentioned, if we can identify who is a specialist that can drive a better outcome, certainly I want to work with those people. As well as if they have a better scoring from a utilization review perspective, they're more likely to be requesting a treatment that is within the MTUS guideline or ACOM guidelines, so that the treatment doesn't hit a barrier where there's a delay in authorization, and frankly, patient gets upset if doctor tells them that we need this treatment and they're not getting it because insurance is not approving it. But if the treating doctor are requesting appropriate treatment, definitely there wouldn't be any issue with the utilization review. So it just helps the treatment to be delivered to the patient quicker, which is what we all want.
Now let's talk a little bit about how you can optimize the network so that it keeps getting better over time and you keep getting better outcomes for more and more people. We all know that care can be good, care can be bad, and if things are done right from the beginning, then workers' comp can go pretty smoothly. But if anything starts to go wrong, then things can spiral out of control very rapidly. So you have to get the right provider in front of the person in the right location at the right time. Gary, would you talk about how AI can facilitate that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So optimizing the MPN for the sort of providers that are going to get your claimants back to work and back to health faster is really super important. And AI does that in a number of ways. So first off, for most of the customers that we've seen over time, somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 30% of their network is composed of doctors who are probably in the lower performing categories, right? And so one of the things that you can use a technology to do is to really sort through and identify, well, who are those providers that are on the lower scoring area, and you can use the tool to effectively go off and try to push away or deprecate out providers that are potentially going to lead to less desirable outcomes. The flip side is also true in that if you have kind of an industry-wide solution where you're looking at all of the providers in a given marketplace, you can identify people who might not be in your network that perhaps you should be reaching out to and bringing into the network, right? And so it's in doing that you get this virtuous cycle. I'd say there's another little thing that is super important here, and this is something that AI helps a ton on. It's kind of a sleeper sort of thing that nobody really talks about a whole bunch, but just identifying who the provider is, right? Because providers may be working in multiple different clinics and multiple different areas, right? And so sometimes it's really super hard to figure out, is this the same doctor across all those things, right? And so that's something that machine learning is particularly good at doing. It's hard, but it's high value because then you have a very complete picture of exactly what sort of thing that you're dealing with. And it's in that way that you can basically drive outcomes for your claimants and for your business.
Yeah, that's interesting. I actually hadn't thought about that idea of identifying providers who you might want to get to. I had always thought of this sort of in terms of evaluating the people who you already know. Nicole, again, how does this look from the adjuster perspective?
Well, taking into account the network that we're working from, having something that is constantly being updated, constantly being looked at is fantastic. We adjusters typically tend to remember the bad doctors, but not always the good doctors. And, we handle, if not the entire state, a large portion of the state. And it's just impossible to really have a mental list or even a paper list of the doctors that we want to use more. So having this at our fingertips where we can look up a specific specialty in a certain location and then have this additional information, their grade, so to speak, is incredibly helpful. Take our time right now in COVID. It's a lot more difficult to find doctors that are open. They've got limited staff, so you're often leaving messages to find out if they treat a certain case, if they're open, if they're doing telehealth, if they're seeing patients in person. So anything you can do to make the job of an adjuster easier by categorizing that or giving some information is beneficial on so many levels. Do I want to find a doctor that is treating COVID patients or has experience with COVID patients? This could be a pulmonologist, this could be a psychologist. COVID is new, and it's, we don't know where it's going to go, but and those bad doctors haven't quite gained their reputation yet, but just having a little more direction provides reliability and confidence so that I can do my job better and, really work for my customer better.
I'm sure while you generally remember the bad doctors, you remember a great doctor like Dr. Kim. So one of the things I've enjoyed about Clara Analytics, which has written a fair amount for insurance thought leadership over the last year and a half, 2 years, is that there are specific examples. I've been covering artificial intelligence in one form or another since I was on the technology beat at the Wall Street Journal back in the mid-1980s, and it's always sort of ephemeral. And it sort of feels like people say, well, we'll just sprinkle fairy dust and everything will be better. So, Gary, could you maybe walk us through one of the sorts of examples that you've provided before, just to tie all this together and explain how this works in practice?
Sure, Paul, absolutely. And to your point, there's a lot of magical selling out there that goes on in the AI market space. And one of the things that we've made a strong commitment to as a company is to make sure that we're able to quantify exactly how this technology can benefit our customers. And so when you think about how can you use AI in the provider space to basically drive some benefit, you think about it this way. So, this is a benchmark example of one of our customers, right? This customer was able to divert 6% of their claims from lower scoring providers. We call them D's and E's, or it's a graded scale, A, B, C, D, E, to higher scoring providers. And, those generally are the ABC sorts of providers, right? And so when we looked at the benchmark data that they had, the difference between the cost per visit of a high scoring versus low scoring provider was $166 or so. And then almost more materially is the fact that the low scoring providers were basically causing a lot more visits per claim than the high scoring ones. So pretty quickly, this customer was able to pick up a benefit of about $1,700 per claim by moving people from these lower scoring providers to high scoring providers, right? So those are kind of direct costs, but then there's some pretty interesting indirect sort of things that are showing up here as well. And that is that if you have a fewer set of visits, right, you're going to have a shorter claim duration. And you're generally going to have lower indemnity costs and claims costs, right? Or expenses, that is, right? Just, you're naturally not going to have to work through stuff as long. So basically, you're even able to pick up, somewhere in the neighborhood of $250 to $300 or so per claim by doing the same basic sort of thing. And now what this doesn't account for, right, is the even softer cost of, how much better is the injured worker going to feel if he or she is back to work faster and back to health quicker, right? The employer themselves is going to wind up feeling better about the situation because they don't wind up having to have the injured worker out for longer and paying for temporary people, or not getting the benefit of that worker coming back to work. And so there's a variety of positive benefits that accrue that just aren't even necessarily here in the dollars and cents of an average claim.
Great. Thanks for that. We're now basically at the end. I just would like to circle back and ask people to remember 4 things from this. First is that AI is a bundle. It's not one particular bit of technology. It's an approach that takes a number of ways of looking at issues and augments the activities that are already happening. Second, that if you do the sort of pooling that Gary described, you can gather a lot more information and be a lot more accurate than you would be otherwise. Third, that AI will help you identify the optimal providers and optimize networks. And then 4, that you can dramatically reduce the claim duration and get to this sort of virtuous circle that Gary was describing. So that is it. I hope we delivered on my promise that it would be pithy and practical. As I said, there is a way for you to click on a button and get the slides and other resources. The fine folks at Clara would be delighted to answer any questions. So I will just sign off by thanking the panelists. You guys were terrific, and thank Clara for sponsoring this. So thanks to all of you who joined us today, and have a great rest of your day.